What happens when a story we trust begins to loosen at the edges? History for most of us arrives as a finished thing. It comes bound in textbooks, arranged in museum glass, narrated in calm voices that suggest the great questions have already been settled. Civilizations rise, empires fall, oceans divide worlds until ships, maps, and ambition pull them back together. We inherit this order the way we inherit a family house, grateful for its shelter, rarely thinking to inspect the cracks in its walls. And yet, now and then, something small appears in the dust. A fragment of bone, a carved stone, a chemical trace in ancient hair. Not enough to destroy the house of history, but enough to make us pause in the doorway and wonder what else may be hidden behind the plaster. The past is full of these quiet interruptions. They do not always arrive with certainty. More often, they come wrapped in doubt, argument, incomplete evidence, and the unmistakable discomfort of not knowing. This is not a journey into certainty. It is a journey into the borderland between what is recorded and what is merely remembered, between discovery and interpretation, between the confidence of official timelines and the humility forced upon us by new questions. Because the deeper we look into the ancient world, the more we encounter signs that human history may be less like a straight road and more like a coastline seen through fog, shaped, real, but never fully visible at once. Across deserts, mountains, caves, and forgotten shores, objects remain. They wait without urgency. They do not demand belief. They ask for something more difficult than belief. They ask for patience. And perhaps that is where every honest search begins, not with answers, but with the willingness to stand before the unknown and admit that the human story may still be unfinished. What if a coastline could remember footsteps long after the people themselves were gone? The sea off British Columbia can look deceptively gentle at first light. Gray water folds into gray sky. Islands drift in and out of mist as though they are still deciding whether to belong to the world of land or dream. Along one remote stretch of shore, researchers began to uncover traces of human life buried beneath layers of earth and time. Evidence that suggested people were present here far earlier than older assumptions once allowed. It was not a grand monument that raised the question, not a palace, not a wall, not a written record. It was something quieter, the remains of settlement, tools shaped by hand, and the subtle signatures of daily survival at the edge of a continent. For generations, the dominant image of the first Americans centered on a later migration through an inland corridor opened by melting ice. It was a powerful model because it felt orderly. It gave the story a gait, a route, a beginning. But coastlines do not respect tidy beginnings. They invite movement. They feed travelers with fish, shellfish, birds, kelp forests, and safe inlets. They offer a ribbon of possibility stretching along the rim of an icebound world. If people arrived earlier by sea hugging the Pacific edge in small craft or seasonal journeys, much of that evidence may now rest underwater, swallowed by rising seas at the end of the last ice age. In that sense, the missing pieces may not be missing at all. They may simply be beyond easy reach. What emerges from such discoveries is not the collapse of history, but its soft revision. The first chapters of human arrival in the Americas may have been more adaptive, more coastal, more inventive than once imagined. Not a single march into emptiness, but a patient conversation between land, water, hunger, and courage. And maybe that is the deeper lesson. The past rarely changes because one dramatic object appears. It changes because small pieces, gathered carefully, begin to alter the shape of the question itself. In the silence of an ancient shore, we are reminded that human beings have always been learners of landscapes, and that sometimes the oldest journeys are the ones the sea keeps longest. How far can a current carry a human dream before the world decides it is impossible? In a museum case, an ancient skull can seem still, almost beyond narrative. Bone is often presented as conclusion, measured, dated, labeled, and placed beneath light. It appears to belong more to science than to story. But some remains refuse to stay quiet. They reopen questions not because they speak clearly, but because they do not fit the sentences written for them. In Brazil, discoveries of very old human remains stirred exactly that kind of unease. Their age suggested a deep human presence in the Americas, and some anatomical features led researchers to ask whether the peopling of the continent may have been more complex than a single migration model once allowed. Such ideas must be handled with care. Bones do not carry passports. They do not reveal identity in any simple way. Interpretation can shift with every new method, every new comparison, every new generation of scientists willing to revisit old assumptions. And yet, the question remains, what if the earliest movement into the Americas unfolded in several waves, across long spans of time, by people who did not all look the same, travel the same routes, or leave the same kinds of traces behind? Human migration has never been a neat procession. It is improvisation on a planetary scale. Storms redirect it. Mountains slow it. Rivers guide it. Climate opens one path and closes another. People adapt, divide, meet, disappear, and continue. What makes these discoveries so compelling is not that they offer a final answer. They do the opposite. They remind us that the human past is broader than any one model can comfortably contain. The first Americans may not have been one people entering one quarter in one moment, but many journeys unfolding across thousands of years, some remembered in landscape, others erased by weather, water, and time. There is something profoundly human in that uncertainty. We want beginnings to be singular because singular beginnings feel easier to understand. But our species has never been simple. We are wanderers, experimenters, carriers of memory and change. And perhaps the oldest bones ask us to accept a difficult truth, that the story of who arrived first may matter less than the deeper fact that humanity has always moved through the world in ways more varied, fragile, and astonishing than our categories can hold. What if one ancient meal could redraw the map of human contact? On the dry slopes of the Egyptian desert, where tomb walls still hold color against the centuries, the dead sometimes preserve what the living forget: hair, teeth, skin, woven cloth. Under the right conditions, time does not erase so much as whisper. And in those whispers, science has learned to listen for chemistry. Molecules linger where voices are gone. Among the most intriguing clues are traces of substances that seem to belong to faraway worlds. In a few ancient mummies, researchers have reported compounds associated with the plants better known from the Americas, including tobacco and coca. The claim has long fascinated the public because its implications feel enormous. If such traces truly reflect ancient use before Columbus, then the story of contact between continents becomes far more complicated. But fascination is not proof, and careful minds have urged restraint. Contamination, later handling, trade in related Old World plants, or flaws in testing can all reshape the meaning of a result. Still, the image is hard to forget. A body laid to rest thousands of years ago, carrying within it the chemical shadow of a distant landscape. It invites an unsettling possibility. Not certainty, but possibility. Could there have been forgotten exchanges across oceans long before the age we call discovery? Could ideas, goods, or people have moved in small, irregular, easily lost ways that left only scattered traces for us to debate? The ancient world was not static. It breathed through trade routes, pilgrim paths, caravan roads, and maritime skill. Human beings have always pushed beyond the visible horizon, sometimes for survival, sometimes for wealth, sometimes for reasons history never records. Yet extraordinary claims require extraordinary patience. A single test is not a civilization. A molecule is not a map, and perhaps that is what makes this mystery so enduring. It lives at the boundary between longing and evidence. We are drawn to the thought that the world was connected earlier than we knew, that strangers once touched shores unrecorded by empire. But the wiser response may be neither belief nor dismissal. It may be attentiveness, the quiet discipline of staying with the question until the past reveals whether it is offering us a hidden road or merely a reflection of our own desire to find one. What if the oldest messages in the world were never written for us at all? Deep beneath the earth in what is now southeastern Europe, archaeologists have uncovered small clay objects marked with curious signs, lines, crosses, chevrons, and patterns pressed into their surfaces thousands of years before the first widely accepted writing systems of Mesopotamia. They are modest things, not grand tablets of awoke your royal decrees, but fragments of a quieter human impulse, the need to record, to symbolize, to hold meaning outside the body for a little while longer. The signs have stirred debate for decades. Some see in them an early form of writing, or at least a precursor to it, a symbolic language developing in settled communities long before conventional timelines say such systems should exist. Others urge caution. Marks are not always words. Symbols may be ritual, decorative, mnemonic, or communal, without crossing the threshold into full writing. The distinction matters, but it is not always easy to fix. Between image and language lies a wide and uncertain territory. What makes these objects so compelling is that they emerge from a world already becoming more complex. Villages were growing, trade and craft were deepening, people were shaping not only tools and homes, but social memory itself. In such a world, symbols become more than ornament. They become containers for trust, exchange, belonging, and belief. A mark on clay can hold a promise. It can name what matters. It can also hide its purpose from everyone who comes too late. If these signs were part of an early system of record, then writing did not begin in a single radiant moment. It grew slowly, unevenly, like dawn moving over different hills at different times. And if they were not writing in the strict sense, they still reveal something just as profound, that human beings were already reaching for abstraction, already trying to preserve thought against forgetting. Perhaps that is the deeper continuity. Long before alphabets and archives, people wanted to leave traces that could outlast breath. They wanted meaning to remain after the speaker was gone. And in those small marked surfaces, we see a familiar ache, the ancient human hope that something fragile inside us might survive by taking form in the world outside. What if a map could remember a world no one was supposed to have seen? Unfold an old chart, and the first thing you notice is not accuracy, but ambition. Coastlines bend with confidence. Mountains rise in decorative ridges. Sea creatures drift through empty water, as if imagination and observation once shared the same ink. Ancient and medieval maps were never just tools. They were arguments about what the world was, how much of it could be known, and who had the right to name its edges. Among the most debated of these documents are maps that seem, at least to some viewers, to contain knowledge that feels misplaced in time. A coastline drawn with surprising precision. A landform that resembles a distant continent, a suggestion that earlier navigators may have seen more than official history comfortably allows. Such claims are alluring because maps carry authority. When a line appears on parchment, it feels deliberate. It feels like memory-given geometry. But maps are also layered objects. They are copied, revised, embellished, mistranslated, and stitched together from older sources of varying quality. A shape that resembles one continent may be another coastline distorted by projection, damaged by copying, or completed by guesswork where information failed. Scholars who study historical cartography often remind us that resemblance is not the same as proof. The human eye is eager to find patterns, especially when the pattern promises a hidden chapter in the story of exploration. Still, the fascination does not disappear. It lingers because these maps reveal something beyond the question of whether one voyage happened earlier than we think. They show how knowledge itself travels. A chart is rarely the work of one mind. It is an accumulation of sailors' reports, inherited fragments, rumors from ports, calculations made under uncertain skies. Every map is a conversation across generations, with errors preserved beside insights. And perhaps that is why these documents remain so haunting. They do not simply show us where people went. They show us how people imagined the unknown before it became familiar. In every unfinished coastline, in every island that vanished from later charts, we meet a deeply human instinct to sketch the world before we fully understand it, and to hope that somewhere between precision and wonder, truth might slowly come into view. What if stone could keep a secret longer than memory ever could? High in the Andes, where the air thins and the horizon feels sharpened by distance, ancient walls still stand with a kind of unnerving composure. Their stones are immense, some cut into irregular shapes that lock together so tightly a blade can scarcely slip between them. Earthquakes have shaken the region for centuries, yet these old structures endure, while newer buildings have often cracked and fallen around them. It is easy, standing before such workmanship, to feel that the past understood something we have only partially recovered. The mystery is not that ancient people built in stone. Human beings have done that across continents and millennia. The deeper question is how skill, labor, planning, and social will converge to move and shape materials on such a scale without modern machinery. Speculation rushes in wherever admiration outruns patience. But the more grounded answer is often the more impressive one. Engineering knowledge built slowly through observation, repetition, and collective intelligence passed from one generation to the next. Stonework like this does not require magic. It requires time. It requires communities organized enough to quarry, transport, carve, and fit massive blocks with astonishing precision. It requires minds intimate with terrain, fracture lines, weight distribution, and seismic behavior, even if those minds never wrote their formulas down. Much of ancient knowledge was practical rather than theoretical, held in hands rather than in books. When those hands vanish, the knowledge can appear miraculous simply because its apprenticeship has been broken. And yet wonder remains appropriate. These walls are not only technical achievements, they are statements of endurance. They tell us that human beings, facing unstable ground and harsh landscapes, learn not merely to survive, but to collaborate with the conditions of the earth itself. The stones do not resist the mountain. In some sense, they listen to it. Perhaps that is why such places move us so deeply. They challenge the quiet arrogance of the present. We tend to imagine progress as a straight ascent, as though every century must know more than the one before it. But history is not a ladder. It is a tide of gains and losses. Some knowledge advances, some disappears. And sometimes in the silence of an ancient wall, we are forced to admit that wisdom can be forgotten even while the evidence of it remains standing in plain sight. What if the oldest observatories were built not to conquer the sky, but to belong to it? Before cities rose in stone and empire marked the earth with roads, there were places where people gathered beneath open heavens and watched. They watched the sun return to the same notch on the horizon. They watched shadows shorten and lengthen. They watched the moon alter its face, the stars wheel through the dark, and the seasons arrive not as dates on a calendar, but as changes in wind, hunger, migration, and light. Long before modern astronomy, there was attention. At certain ancient sites, that attention seems almost architectural. Massive stones, carefully placed openings, and aligned chambers suggest that some communities built with the sky in mind. The debate is often not whether celestial alignments exist, but how deliberate, precise, and culturally central they were. Did these structures function as observatories in any formal sense? Were they ritual spaces that also track cycles of light? Or are some apparent alignments the result of our tendency to discover intention and patterns that emerge by chance over time? Such questions matter because they ask us how ancient people understood their place in the cosmos. To follow the heavens was not an abstract hobby. It was a form of survival and meaning. The motion of the sky governed planting, harvesting, ceremony, and migration. It ordered sacred time. It gave communities a way to anticipate change and to anchor themselves within a world that could otherwise feel unstable. A sunrise falling into the center of a stone passage was more than a spectacle. It was a reunion between human design and cosmic rhythm. What can feel surprising to modern minds is not that ancient people observed the heavens, but how consistently and deeply they seem to have integrated that knowledge into daily life. Today, many of us live under bright roofs and glowing screens, half forgetting that our ancestors once learned time by watching light touch the earth. Their science, ritual, and wonder were not always separate categories. And maybe that is the quiet revelation hidden in these sites. They remind us that knowledge does not begin in laboratories alone. It also begins in reverence, in repetition, in patient noticing. The ancient sky was not simply above humanity, it was part of the human conversation. And perhaps the enduring mystery is not how our ancestors saw so much, but how easily we learned to stop looking. What if the most astonishing machine of the ancient world was built not to amaze us, but simply to understand time? Recovered in fragments from a shipwreck, corroded by salt and silence, the device did not look like a revolution at first. It looked broken, a lump of bronze, gear teeth barely visible beneath centuries of mineral crust. And yet, as scholars slowly examined its interior, something extraordinary emerged, a mechanism of layered precision capable of modeling celestial cycles with a sophistication once thought impossible for its age. The machine is often described as an ancient analog computer, though that phrase, useful as it is, can flatten its humanity. This was not just technology, it was thought made tangible. It was mathematics translated into turning wheels, astronomy embodied in metal, prediction housed in craftsmanship. Whoever designed it understood that the sky moved according to patterns, and that those patterns could be represented through ratios, gears, and motions small enough to fit in the hands. Its existence unsettled old assumptions not because it proved the ancient world was mysterious in some supernatural sense, but because it revealed a level of technical imagination we had underestimated. We often distribute intelligence too neatly across history. We imagine progress unfolding in a smooth climb, as though complexity belongs naturally to the modern and simplicity to the distant past. But this mechanism suggests another truth. Knowledge can flower brilliantly in one era, then fracture, disappear, and leave later generations wondering how such understanding was ever lost. There is a quiet sadness in that realization. Not every breakthrough survives. Libraries burn, empires collapse. Skills tied to individuals or small communities vanish when conditions change. The story of human knowledge is not merely accumulation, it is also erosion. The ancient world did not move in darkness, waiting for us to switch on the light. It produced its own forms of brilliance, some of which we inherited, and some of which slipped beneath the waterline of memory. Perhaps that is why this device feels so moving. It is more than an artifact. It is evidence of a mind reaching toward order in the turning of the heavens. And in that act, it becomes familiar. Across the centuries, we recognize the same desire in ourselves, to make sense of movement, to find rhythm and complexity, and to believe that with enough patience, even time itself can be touched, measured, and briefly understood. What if the deepest mystery is not that ancient people knew too little, but that sometimes they knew enough to disappear into legend? In the deserts of Peru, the ground itself seems to become language. Vast lines stretch across the earth, forming geometric paths, animals, and shapes only fully visible from above or from the surrounding hills. At first glance, they appear almost impossible in their scale, as though designed for an eye no human should have possessed in that age. And because they are so large, so exposed, and so strangely serene, they invite almost every kind of explanation, from the careful to the fantastical. But the most grounded interpretations may also be the most profound. These geoglyphs were likely created through deliberate communal effort, with simple tools, patient planning, and an intimate knowledge of the landscape. They may have served ritual purposes, marked pathways, honored water, mapped sacred relationships, or gathered multiple meanings over generations. Their mystery lies not in the impossibility of their construction, but in the partial silence surrounding their purpose. We can see the forms. We cannot fully recover the minds that made them. That distance matters. Modern people often assume that if a structure is large, intricate, or symbolically complex, then its makers must have possessed hidden powers or lost technologies beyond ordinary explanation. Yet this assumption can diminish what human communities have always been capable of through cooperation, memory, and time. Great works do not require myths to become meaningful. They require only human intention meeting patience on a large enough scale. And still, while standing before these markings, one feels something more than admiration. There is a tenderness in the effort. To clear dark stones from pale soil across miles of desert is to believe that meaning can be inscribed upon the land itself. It is to trust that future eyes, whether divine, communal, or unborn, will one day witness the gesture. The lines are not just designs. They are acts of attention preserved in an almost impossible stillness. Perhaps that is why they continue to move us. They remind us that not every human creation was meant to dominate nature or outshine it. Some were made to enter into conversation with it. The desert, the sky, the rare arrival of water, the turning of seasons, all may have been part of the message. And in that sense, the enduring enigma is not who made these forms, but whether we still remember how to create something so vast, so patient, and so humble that it speaks across centuries without ever raising its voice. What if the oldest medicines were less about curing the body than about understanding the delicate conversation between pain, hope, and the natural world? In a cave, in a burial, in the residue clinging to an ancient vessel, traces of plants sometimes survive longer than the names of the people who gathered them. Pollen grains, fibers, chemical compounds. They are faint signatures, but they hint at something deeply familiar. Long before modern pharmacology, human beings were already experimenting with the earth, learning which roots soothed, which leaves sharpened, which resins calmed fever or altered consciousness. Survival depended not only on strength, but on attention. Some discoveries suggest that this knowledge may have been more complex and perhaps older than older narratives once assumed. Plant use in ancient contexts can reveal ritual, healing, intoxication, preservation, or all of these at once. The line between medicine and ceremony was rarely clean. To ease pain, to speak with the dead, to mark a transition, to enter grief, to endure surgery, to confront illness, these may have drawn on the same botanical world. Modern categories separate science from spirituality. Ancient lives often did not. That does not mean every interpretation is secure. Residues can be contaminated. Context can be disturbed. A plant found near human remains does not automatically prove intentional use. Archaeology teaches humility precisely because evidence is fragile and meaning is layered. And yet, even with that caution, the broader picture is unmistakable. Early societies were not passive before disease or suffering. They observed, tested, remembered, and passed on practical knowledge in ways that do not always leave behind written proof. There is something moving in that continuity. Across thousands of years, people turned to bark, seed, flower, and fungus for relief, for guidance, for endurance. A healer crushing leaves by firelight was not practicing a lesser form of understanding. They were participating in an ancient human tradition, learning from the living world with whatever tools experience allowed. Perhaps that is why these traces matter so much. They remind us that knowledge does not begin when it is formally recorded. It begins in care, in watching over the sick, in noticing what helps, in repeating what works, and in that slow apprenticeship between human vulnerability and the intelligence of nature. We glimpse a quieter history, one in which wisdom was not always written down, but was carried in memory, hands, and trust from one life into the next. What if the past survives most powerfully not in monuments, but in the things we still do without remembering why? Across the ancient world, there are gestures that seem to echo from one civilization to another. The alignment of structures to the sun, the burial of treasured objects with the dead, the shaping of symbols that resemble stars, serpents, spirals, or trees. Sometimes these similarities tempt us toward grand conclusions, as though every parallel must point to one lost source, one vanished mother culture, one hidden chain connecting all human meaning. It is an alluring thought, but human beings do not need a single script to arrive at familiar symbols. They share the same sky, the same fear of death, the same dependence on seasons, fire, birth, and memory. This is where the study of ancient anomalies becomes most delicate. A resemblance can be real without proving direct contact. A shared pattern can arise not from secret transmission, but from the repeated conditions of being human. People everywhere watch the heavens. People everywhere bury their dead. People everywhere seek order in cycles of growth and ruin. Similar answers may emerge because the questions themselves are universal. And yet, universality is not a small thing. If distant cultures, separated by oceans or mountains, returned again and again to similar images and rituals, that tells us something profound about the structure of human thought. We are makers of meaning in a world that rarely explains itself. We turn to stone, pigment, ceremony, and story to bridge the gap between what we know and what we fear. We create patterns not only to describe the world, but to endure it. The ancient discoveries that trouble official timelines often do more than challenge dates or roots. They challenge our appetite for neat distinctions between advanced and primitive, isolated and connected, mythic and rational. The past was never as simple as our categories. It was full of overlap, reinvention, forgotten brilliance, and recurring human impulses that emerged wherever people had time to look, mourn, measure, and imagine. Perhaps that is the quiet truth gathering beneath all these mysteries. The world our ancestors inhabited was not empty of intelligence waiting to become modern. It was crowded with observation, symbolism, skill, and longing. And when fragments of that world seem strangely familiar to us now, the surprise may reveal less about them than about our own forgetting. We are not separate from the ancient mind. We are one of its later echoes, still trying to remember what it once knew by heart. What if the greatest discovery hidden inside these ancient puzzles is not about the past at all, but about the limits of our certainty in the present? By the time we reach the far edges of history, evidence becomes a fragile companion. A shard of pottery, a tooth, a stain of pigment, a line carved into stone. These are not speeches from the dead. They are fragments. They survive by accident, and because they survive unevenly, they can tempt us into stories that are either too confident or too cynical. We either ask too much of them, forcing them to confirm our favorite mysteries, or too little, dismissing them because they do not fit what we already believe. The wiser path is narrower and more demanding. It asks us to hold wonder and discipline together, to let an artifact remain astonishing without turning it into fantasy, to let evidence remain incomplete without pretending it says nothing. This balance is difficult because human beings crave resolution. We want the final map, the first inventor, the single origin, the missing key. But the past rarely offers itself in such clean shapes. More often it arrives like light through leaves, broken, shifting, beautiful, and partial. Perhaps that is why these discoveries endure in the public imagination. Not merely because they are old, but because they expose something timeless in us. We are still the same meaning-making creatures who once watched the stars, shaped symbols in clay, and carved memory into earth and stone. We still gather fragments and try to build coherence from them. We still confuse the elegance of our explanations with the fullness of reality. And we are still learning that knowledge is strongest, not when it closes every question, but when it teaches us how to live honestly with uncertainty. In that sense, the anomalies of history are not threats to understanding. They are invitations to improve it. They call scholars to test harder, listen better, and revise more humbly. They call the rest of us to a quieter form of curiosity, one less interested in shock than in depth, less eager for hidden empires than for the subtle resilience of human ingenuity. And maybe that is the real threshold we have been approaching all along. Not a secret chamber of forbidden truth, but a mature encounter with mystery itself. The kind that does not humiliate reason, but deepens it. The kind that reminds us that every timeline is a model, every reconstruction provisional, and every generation only a temporary custodian of the human story before passing it, still unfinished, to the next. In the end, the ancient world does not stand behind us as neatly as we imagine. It moves beside us, sometimes ahead of us, asking questions we are still learning how to hear. In the fragments of old coastlines, in chemical traces, buried symbols, carved stones, celestial alignments, forgotten machines, and vast marks drawn across the land, we do not find a single hidden answer. We find something both gentler and more demanding. Evidence that human history is richer, less orderly, and more alive than any final version can contain. What these discoveries offer is not permission to abandon reason, but a reason to practice it more fully. They remind us that skepticism and wonder are not enemies. The careful scholar and the curious listener are engaged in the same task, to approach the unknown without distorting it into certainty too soon. Some mysteries will eventually yield to better methods, sharper dating, deeper excavations, and new comparisons. Others may remain unresolved, not because they are unreal, but because time has erased too much. Loss is part of the archive. Silence is part of the record. And still, what survives is extraordinary. Across continents and millennia, human beings observed the stars, crossed dangerous waters, built with patience, experimented with nature, invented systems of meaning, and tried to leave traces that would outlast their own brief lives. That effort feels familiar because it is still our effort. We too are trying to make sense of a world larger than our explanations. We too build instruments, record symbols, preserve memory, and argue over what the evidence means. Perhaps this is the most human conclusion of all. The past is not a closed vault of answers, but a conversation interrupted and resumed across generations. Every discovery is a partial reply. Every unanswered question is a sign that the conversation continues. So the real wonder may not be that ancient history still holds mysteries. It may be that, despite distance, ruin, and forgetting, we can still feel the minds of other human beings reaching toward us through stone, metal, dust, and light. And when we listen carefully, we hear not certainty, but kinship, the enduring sound of a species trying in every age to understand where it has been, what it has learned, and how much of itself still remains to be discovered.